Open on a map of Ontario. Two thin lines appear at once. One runs from Ottawa down to Kingston, tracing more than 200 kilometers through the interior. The other threads 386 kilometers northwest from Lake Ontario all the way to Georgian Bay. Neither line touches the US border. Both sit entirely on Canadian soil. Canada built two separate water corridors through its own wilderness, designed so soldiers, supplies, and trade could move without ever crossing water the United States could control. Together, they took nearly 100 years to build and cost over $1 billion in today's money. So why did Canada keep building secret backdoors through its own landscape? And why does that question matter right now? To understand what Canada was trying to solve, you need to look at the map. The St. Lawrence River is Canada's main inland water corridor. It connects the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes, running along the US border, partially shared with American territory. That shared stretch is the problem. The St. Lawrence is not just a trade route, it is a supply line. And a supply line that runs through shared water is a supply line your enemy can cut. The War of 1812 proved this was not theoretical. American forces invaded using the Great Lakes corridor. Canadian and British supply lines were exposed along the St. Lawrence. The river that connected the interior to the coast was the same river the enemy could block. Canada needed a different route, one that moved soldiers and supplies between Montreal and the interior without ever touching water the United States could control. The geography of Ontario offered an answer. The province's interior holds a natural chain of rivers and lakes. If those waterways could be connected, they could form a protected corridor running entirely on British and Canadian soil. But they do not connect naturally. They sit at different elevations, separated by ridges of Canadian shield granite. Connecting them meant forcing the landscape into something it was not. Canada's first answer came in 1826. British Army Lieutenant Colonel John By was assigned to build a military canal from Ottawa to Kingston, 202 kilometers long, entirely on British soil, explicitly designed to move troops and supplies away from the exposed St. Lawrence. By divided the route into 23 sections and built all of them simultaneously. Hundreds of Irish and French-Canadian laborers, Scottish stonemasons, and British Army engineers worked by hand through swamps, solid granite, and malaria-infested wilderness. Nearly 1,000 workers and family members died, most from disease. The project came in at roughly 5 times its original budget. 5 years after construction began, the Rideau Canal opened in 1832. It stretched 202 kilometers with 47 locks, most still hand-operated today. The slackwater method that By pioneered flooded existing river valleys rather than cutting entirely new channels, using the natural landscape to do work that granite would not permit. It was one of the great engineering achievements of the 19th century. The construction camp By established at the northern end of the canal became the city of Ottawa. Canada's capital did not start as a planned capital. It started as a military bypass. A supply corridor accidentally created the seat of government. But the Rideau only solved the eastern problem. It connected Ottawa to Kingston to the edge of Lake Ontario. Canada still had no protected route going west. The logic of the second canal was immediate. If Rideau connected Ottawa to Lake Ontario, the next leg needed to push northwest from Lake Ontario all the way to Georgian Bay on Lake Huron, deep into the interior and beyond any realistic American reach. Together, the two canals would form a continuous corridor, Montreal to Ottawa, to Kingston, to Georgian Bay, entirely on Canadian soil, never touching the St. Lawrence. Construction on what would become the Trent-Severn Waterway began in 1833, 1 year after the Rideau opened. But this was not a coordinated national project with a single builder. It started at Bob Kagan to serve local timber traffic. Nobody approached a 386-kilometer waterway from the beginning. Engineers solved one local problem, then the next, and the route grew outward over decades. The path runs from Trenton on Lake Ontario up through the Trent River, across the Kawartha Lakes, to a summit at Kirkfield sitting 256 meters above sea level, then down through Lake Simcoe and the Severn River to Georgian Bay. On a map with both canals shown together, the full strategic picture becomes visible. 2 canals, 1 vision, 1 protected inland spine running through the heart of Ontario. The Trent Severn refused to follow the Redow's example of a single coordinated push. It grew 1 lock at a time, decade after decade, driven by political politicians, timber companies, and settlers. Meanwhile, the world kept moving. The Grand Trunk Railway reached Toronto in 1856. The Canadian Pacific completed its transcontinental line in 1885, a full 35 years before the last Trent Severn lock would open. Freight now had a faster, cheaper, year-round option. The commercial case was gone before the canal was finished. What kept the project going was the weight of what had already been built. Every completed section created towns, timber operations, and local navigation that depended on what came before it. Too many people depended on it. Too much had been spent to stop. By 1884, most engineers had written the project off at its most difficult points. Then Richard Birdsall Rogers arrived with a proposal at a scale that had never been attempted anywhere on Earth. Rogers designed a hydraulic lift lock that would raise an entire boat 65 feet using no engine, no motor, and no pump. 2 chambers, each carrying a boat, balanced against each other. Adding a small amount of water to the upper chamber made it heavier. Gravity did the rest. Most engineers considered it impractical at that scale. Rogers built it anyway. The Peterborough lift lock opened in 1904. It was the highest hydraulic boat lift on Earth at the time of its opening, and the largest unreinforced concrete structure in the world at the time of its construction. A second lift lock at Kirkfield handled the summit. At the western end, Big Chute used a steel railway carriage to carry boats over a granite ridge entirely out of the water, still the only structure of its kind operating in North America. Canada was producing world record engineering for a strategic corridor that railways had already rendered obsolete. The ambition kept growing, while the rationale kept shrinking. The last lock on the Trent Severn opened in 1920, 87 years after the first. The protected inland corridor Canada spent all that time building never carried a single warship. Neither did the Redow. The threat those canals were built to answer never arrived. But the infrastructure did not disappear. The Redow's construction camp became Ottawa. The Trent Severn's dams raised water levels across entire lake systems, turning rocky shallow shores into navigable lakefront. Ontario's cottage country exists because of a military canal nobody needed. Both canals permanently changed the landscape in ways nobody planned. Both canals are national historic sites today, still operational, drawing recreation, tourism, and the communities that grew along their banks. The Rideau Canal is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized not for military achievement, but for the engineering technique it pioneered. Canada built 2 massive infrastructure projects in fear of what the United States might do. Neither delivered the outcome it was designed to produce. Both permanently changed the map. In 2026, Canada is once again asking how much it can depend on the United States for trade, energy, and supply chains. The same instinct is back on the table. Canada has answered this question twice with concrete and steel, and both times the threat never fully arrived. If Canada builds again, will the answer come in time, or will it arrive too late like the canals before it? Return to the opening map. Both lines still there. Ottawa to Kingston, Trenton to Georgian Bay. Canada spent nearly 100 years building 2 escape routes from a threat that never fully came. The canals are still running. The question they were built to answer is back on the table.